This is Abigail Favale, and you're listening to George Fox Talks Culture. Well, I'm super excited to be in the studio here with Dr. Luke Petach of Belmont University, an economist and professor, and also a former student of mine. So this is super fun for me. So back in the day when I coached the debate team at George Fox, Luke was on the debate team, and we had this amazing crew for several years it was just a really fun time. And then he went on to get his Ph.D. in economics and somewhere in Colorado, right? Or remind me.
Yeah, Colorado State University.
Colorado State. That's where my parents met, Fort Collins. Yeah, it's a beautiful town.
Yeah, great town.
Mm-hmm. And now you're in Tennessee.
Yeah.
How do you like it?
It's great. One thing, Tennessee in some ways, it reminds me of the Pacific Northwest and that it's very green here. So living in Colorado for 5 years, it's very dry, very brown. So moving out here, it rains a lot and it's green. So I grew up in Oregon, so it's like a little bit of home. So that's nice.
And you're a GFU alum. So what year did you graduate?
So I graduated from George Fox in 2014. And then I went straight to graduate school after I graduated, finished my Ph.D. in the spring of 2019, and then started here at Belmont as an assistant professor fall 2019.
Awesome. So you've just gone right through each step smoothly. Yeah.
Basically.
That's awesome. Yeah. Congrats.
I would not have, when I started at George Fox in 2010 as an undergrad, I would not have thought this is where I would have ended up.
Really? What would you have predicted then?
Well, I don't know. I started as a film studies major, so I don't know. I guess I thought I was going to be the next Scorsese or whatever, but I quickly realized that was not going to happen. So,
So what drew you to economics?
Yeah, that's a question people always ask. So as an undergrad, I was an econ philosophy double major.
Oh yeah, I should remember that.
What economics offers is a really kind of structured way of thinking about a lot of the problems in kind of philosophy, particularly moral philosophy, issues of distributive justice that I was interested in. And so I found it to be a compelling framework for thinking about some of those issues. And then also, I was considering graduate school like my senior year, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to go in philosophy or economics. And I actually had a conversation, well, two things. One, Nate Peach, who's now no longer at Fox, but was taught many of my economics courses, kind of pushed me towards economics graduate school and was really encouraging there. And second, I had a conversation with now retired Martin Cloud Harrison, who absolute legend. And Mark was basically like, look, like the job market for philosophy PhDs is not very good. He's like, and if you get into a top 20 program, there's no guarantee you get a job. And so he was like, if that's what you want to do, like, I'll support you. But he was very realistic about what the job market looked like. And so I made sort of a practical decision to apply to econ graduate school, and it worked out.
Yeah, I guess. So have you been able to still draw on your background in philosophy, like in your graduate work and then in your current work as a professor?
Yeah, definitely so. So my kind of research areas are basically kind of the macroeconomics of long-run growth and income and wealth inequality. And so thinking about issues of distributive justice, kind of motivates that work, although some of that work is less, it's not necessarily moral philosophy more than it is kind of constructing positive models of how the economy works and testing those implications. But I'm interested in thinking about kind of, are there policies that could both make the economy a fairer place, more equal place, while also not kind of sacrificing economic growth or economic activity? So can we find, economists like to talk a lot about, an efficiency equity trade-off. And so sometimes, economists frame equity as coming at the cost of efficiency. And so one way to read some of the work that I've done is thinking about, are there policies are there places where there's inefficiencies that when we correct them also improve the distribution of wealth or income in a way that's more equitable? And so that kind of philosophical problems motivate my thinking about the economy, even if it's not, I'm not working in moral philosophy directly in any way.
Yeah, but this sounds almost like a more helpful, forgive me, philosophers who are out there, but the fact that you're able to actually apply practically some of the concerns of moral philosophy in ways that might actually work in the real world, that seems like a pretty sweet spot to be in.
It can be. I wouldn't say, I think some of the kind of economic modeling, economic theory work is still pretty abstract.
Yeah.
But maybe one step in the direction of reality closer.
Okay, I'm excited about this. This will be a radical role reversal in that I am your student, Dr. Petach, because I don't know anything about economics. Although, and also, do you say economics or economics?
People say it both ways.
Okay, good.
I say economics usually.
Yeah. Economics. Okay, I don't know. I might just flip back and forth. I'm going to be non-committal. But what you just described in somehow finding a place where you have an economic system that works, but that also is as just as it can be, like finding that fruitful tension between those things, that's where I get really confused, right? Because I look at different possibilities like socialism, communism, capitalism from more of just an idealist perspective, and I think, okay, well, this seems like a better or more just system. But then the question of, okay, but does it actually work? Does it actually work in the real world is a totally separate question, of which I feel like I know even less about that. So I don't know, maybe one good way to start is to hear more about what work you've done in terms of economic inequality and wealth disparity, and maybe what the lay of the land is in the US and maybe even the world. I don't know how wide-ranging your work goes. So what's the status quo, and then what are some of the forces driving wealth disparity?
Okay. So the status quo is that in much of the developed world, so the United States and Western Europe, inequality by any number of measures has basically been rising at a slow but steady rate for the past, 40 years or so. And there's debates about how great the increase in inequality has been. People get into the really nitty gritty about how are you measuring it? Is this statistic really measured exactly correctly? And it doesn't really, any series you look at, even given those, squabbles where you might get, some number that's 1% higher, 1% lower, the trends are towards increasing inequality. So some common measures might be, if we're talking about income inequality, just the share of income going to the top 10% of earners or the top 1% of earners. And so in most advanced economies, let's take the United States, the United Kingdom, France, for example, increasing in all those economies. There's also been an increase in the share of wealth held by the top 1% of wealth owners. So income is a flow, right? It's defined over a period. It's your earnings over a given period of time. Wealth is a stock. So we can point to the value of wealth at a given point in time. Wealth in general is always more unequally held than income. And that's because wealth is passed intergenerationally in a way that income is not. So, think about if my grandparents were very wealthy, they can pass that down to me. But if my grandparents, earned a lot of income but didn't save and had no wealth, there's no guarantee that I'm going to earn a lot of income. Right. So we would expect wealth to be held more unequally than income, but it's also been increasing. We could also look at measures of what are called the functional distribution of income. So you can think about basically income earned based on your place in the process, right? So you could earn income from your place as a laborer, so it's wage income, and take total wages over total income in the economy. That's something we call the wage share, the labor share. That's been trending downward. We could also income earned based on the fact that you're an owner of capital, so it's profit income. And we could look at the total profit income and national income. The profit share, what's sometimes called the capital share, national income has been going up. And so those are the general kind of sort of trends. in inequality. And now there's a whole lot of theories or debate about what's generating those trends. There's a lot of disagreement about, so inequality is rising. Is this mean there's something we should do about it, right? Is there, right? And you can break that debate down into, is it inefficient that inequality is rising? And so this is really the kind of metric for action that economists use. And so maybe I'll come back to that in a second, but then there's all agreement about, okay, even if it's efficient, maybe it's not just, and that's more of a normative debate, right, which economists don't necessarily like to wade into, but I think economists like to think we can neatly separate kind of positive and normative claims. And if we just keep, make positive claims or focus on describing the economy, we can avoid, but really it's very hard to do that in practice, I think. And so in terms of descriptively what's causing that, a lot of economists will talk about skill biased technical change, which is a jargony way of saying, the labor market has demanded, quote unquote, higher skilled workers, which is a terminology I don't like, but basically less kind of manual task intensive jobs or jobs that involve kind of, cerebral thinking, math skills, these types of things. Second, globalization, so just competition between low wage workers domestically and abroad leads to widening in the skill distribution. Some economists, so famously Tom Piketty, Gabriel Zuck, Emmanuel Sayad, and that kind of group, point to also changes in the tax code as affecting kind of pre-tax income shares. So if you look at marginal tax rates in the United States, in the 50s and 60s, the marginal tax rates, so that is the tax rate in the top bracket, not the average tax rate, but the tax rate on every dollar earned above whatever the threshold in the top bracket was close to 90%, and it's come down to its 37% right now. So you can think about, they point to the fact that when you have really high marginal tax rates, this disincentivizes people to earn really high levels of income, right? So it also compresses the pre-tax distribution, and so changes in the tax code. So there's all these, and there's lots of other different stories out there about what's driving the increase in inequality. And so there's these different arguments about, what can we sort of do about it? And stop me at any time.
So I have a question. Like, what kind of disparity are we talking about? Like, is there a number you can put on, let's just say in the United States, between that group you're talking about, that top, let's say 10% of earners? Let's talk about income rather than wealth, now that you've made that helpful distinction. Like, what are we talking here in terms of disparity? How unequal is it?
Yeah. So I will tell you the top income share. So for the top 1% of earners in the US, that's somewhere around, and this is, you can give or take, this is estimate the way that they, Piketty originally, so this is a Piketty famous paper back from 2003, and then he's updated these statistics. His book Capital in the 21st Century came out in 2014, but using tax data, the top 1% of earners earn approximately 20% of all income in the United States, around that much. And that's increased from kind of the trough it was at in, about 1970 of about 10%. So it's basically that share is about doubled since the 1970s, early 1980s. Another metric is, like I said, the labor share of income. Historically, it was kind of a stylized fact that factor shares, so labor share, profit share, are constant, and the labor share was always 2/3. It's, depending on what estimates you look at, gone down from anywhere between 6 and 10 percentage points. So those are two different estimates, but top income shares have about doubled since 1970.
So what's happening to everyone else, I guess, who's not in that 1%? Is it stagnant? Is it growing but more slowly? Like, what's the whole picture here, I guess?
Yeah, well, so the income share, right? So income shares, right? It's a share. So if the top 1%, if the share of income going to the top 1% is expanding, the share of income, by definition, going to everyone else has gone down, or at least for some group, it has to have gone down if the share going to that particular group has gone up. Now, across the board, kind of growth in average incomes, or one way you could think about it is kind of the average growth rate of the economy, which is a nice metric of kind of how fast opportunities are growing overall for everyone, has slowed somewhat over the past, I don't know, 20 to 30 years. So there's this big literature on secular stagnation, which looks at the slowdown in productivity growth in advanced economies. And so this is, for middle class households, those in the middle of the income distribution, it hasn't been great. So for some of those households, I don't know exactly. I'd have to go and look at the data, but the share of national income that they're earning has gone down just by the definition of shares, given that the share of the top 1% has gone up. For others, it's been roughly constant. But if you look at kind of income growth for different percentiles of the distribution, the growth that we have experienced has by and large favored those at the top of the income distribution. So globally, there's this graph that's sometimes referred to as the elephant curve. And it's because it looks like an elephant when you draw it. And so if you plot the share of global growth, what it looks like is it goes up for like the bottom, I don't know, 10 to 40% globally, right? So there's been growth for the poorest in the world, which is a good thing.
Right.
But then for those that are kind of middle to just below the top, it's been relatively slow over the past, 20, 30 years. And then it kind of really tips up at the top of the distribution.
Okay.
Because global growth has favored those at the top. So,
okay. And the bottom though. So it sounds like
globally, yes.
Okay.
So towards the bottom of the distribution, right? If we're looking at the global, now I'm kind of shifting gears on you, but if we're looking at the global income distribution, since 1980, late 1980s, there's been growth at the bottom of the global income distribution. And that's driven by the very poorest people in India and China kind of coming out of poverty, being drawn into urban areas. And so there's been growth there. But then as you get to kind of you're the top, but not quite at the top, so the average person at the US level is towards the top of the global income distribution. Right. The percentage increase in real income has been close to zero. But then as you get to the very top again of the global income distribution, the top 1% in the US, very high percentage increase in real incomes over this period.
Wow. Okay.
So the story, and sorry, I kind of brought in the kind of global story there too. But so the story is different depending if you're looking at just within the US or Western Europe or if you're looking globally.
Okay. So let's talk about the global story then. What is that story?
I mean, I think generally more positive, and that the past, several decades have seen big increases in standards of living for kind of the poorest people in the world. And that's, again, driven by basically China and India and people living in poverty there, kind of in rural areas, being pulled into cities, having their incomes go up. And so they've experienced pretty significant income growth. And so that's actually kind of a success story. The percentage of people in global poverty has been steadily decreasing. So if you measure that by people living on less than $1 or $2 a day, that's been going down for a long time now. So that's a success story relative to kind of what's happening within the US or within countries in Western Europe. If we look across countries, there's been significant progress against global poverty.
So is that like a capitalism success story?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, because it's hard to, like I said, a lot of this is due to what's happening in China. And so how much of that is capitalism versus, I mean, it's, so I don't know. I think it's more complicated than that.
Yeah. Okay.
But, maybe some of it is. I don't know.
Well, I want to kind of dig into this idea of capitalism, but maybe a little bit later because I have some more questions about what you've been describing. So I don't know if you can answer this. I mean, you're like an encyclopedia, and so I'm just going to kind of ask anything I want. But if you can't answer it, that's totally fine. But I'm curious, in the United States, so shifting back to the United States, how does this terrain, or does it at all, map onto kind of the political landscape of America? So are there places in the United States where there's more or less income disparity? And do those tend to be blue states, red states? Is there nothing consistent there? I'm curious how that shakes out, if there are any patterns.
Yeah, so this is something that I've worked on specifically, and it's something that's an interest to me. So my dissertation was on basically a lot of the work I do is thinking about these macroeconomic problems, but through the lens of regional economic data in the US and kind of how I can use regional data to get at and answer these problems. And so one kind of fact that people in the regional and urban literature are grappling with is the decline of regional income convergence. So
and what's that?
Yeah. So
okay, good.
If I were to take the poorest places, so imagine we arrange on, you have a graph, and on the horizontal axis, you plot income per person in 1940. And on the vertical axis, you plot growth in income per person between 1940 and 1960.
Okay.
Over that time period, the places that are towards the origin, right? So the poorest places on the horizontal axis grew the fastest over the next 20 years. So basically what you would have is a downward sloping line. So the poor places were growing fast, rich places were growing slow, which means that the poor places were catching up to the rich places. And so this is what you had in the United States in the kind of middle part of the 20th century. You had poor states growing faster than rich states. So places were becoming more alike in terms of their standards of living and quality of life. That process has stopped. So between 1990 and today, if you draw that same graph, the line is either horizontal or, depending on kind of your endpoint and how you're measuring growth, upward sloping, right? So meaning there's horizontal line, there's no convergence. If it's upward sloping, there's divergence, right? That would mean rich places are growing faster. Right. And so that's kind of the situation we're at now. And so one kind of implication is that rising inequality has led to kind of a spatial divergence in standards of living and in outcomes within the United States. And this kind of makes sense, right? If you observe that the top 1% share is growing, unless all the people in the top 1% are kind of distributed equally across space, it has to be the case that different places are kind of pulling away and some are doing better than other places. And so economists, political scientists, people kind of at that intersection have thought a lot about this in conjunction to things like populism in the United States. And can this explain, recent electoral patterns? And is it related to things like, the opioid crisis and deaths of despair? So Angus Deaton has a book called Deaths of Despair and the Future of Capitalism that's looking at this, and it's kind of linking differential regional fortunes in terms of the economy in the US to these various health outcomes. And so there's been a lot written on this. And I think it's one consequence, and maybe for me, one of the more troubling consequences of rising inequality overall is that increasingly kind of where you're located in space has a huge impact on your economic livelihood over your lifespan.
Right. So I'm assuming that the richer places are the coasts, like New York, California. Is that pretty consistent, or are there some surprises?
Yeah. So it's driven by the term urban economists use is called agglomeration economies. I don't know why we have to invent these terrible, sounding words for everything, but basically meaning people are more productive when they co-locate together, right? So there's productivity spillovers from density, basically. And so you would kind of anticipate that there's this type of increasing returns effect. But some of the divergence, right? It wouldn't be so troubling if that opportunity was available to everyone. Kind of looking at causes of that divergence, one thing people have focused on is the housing market and looking at, so there's a paper in Journal of Urban Economics in, I think 2019 by Ganong and Shoag, where they look at that divergence plot, and what they show is that basically among areas that had very little restrictions on building new housing supply, there's still some convergence, whereas areas where it was really hard to build new housing, which includes all the big prosperous coastal cities, that's where kind of convergence has stopped. And so there's, inequality is linked to these kind of local level phenomenon in the literature in that way. Sorry, I don't think I answered your question.
No, I have more questions. So what about within, so not, let's say not comparing, I don't know, like Mississippi with New York, right? Obviously you'd see a lot of divergence there. But what about within a state, like say within California? So it's one of the wealthiest states. But what about the disparity within that state between the richest and the poorest? What does that look like compared to, say, maybe a poorer state overall? But is there less inequality in a state that's poorer overall, like Mississippi or Ohio? Does that make sense, the question I'm asking?
Yeah, I'm not sure of the answer off the top of my head. I know within a state like California, it's just so big that there's so much variation within the state, right? That there is, significant difference between opportunity. If you're if you grow up, if your parents are physicians in San Francisco, your life outcomes are going to be much different than if they're, migrant agricultural workers in Bakersfield. But I don't know how that variance compares to elsewhere in the country. I do know that this focus in general on kind of divergence between urban and rural outcomes is related to what I was talking about earlier, and has also been something that economists and sociologists, political scientists have been focusing more on. And so that can include within state kind of differences, but I'm not sure how those compare to between state differences. If those are larger or smaller or not, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. So my guess is those differences are a little bit smaller than the between state, but that could be wrong.
Okay. So let's talk about some specific policies that might have effects on income inequality. So one policy, for example, that states take different approaches to is the minimum wage. So you have some folks who will say, well, if you just raise the minimum wage for everyone in an area, then that will help. That will kind of elevate everyone, right? And then critics of that approach will say no, because then you're just actually making it worse, because it then becomes much harder to even run a business. It makes it more expensive to live there. Right? So what's your opinion on that as an economist? Like, which approach to minimum wage is perhaps better at addressing income disparity?
Yeah, so the minimum wage is a topic that there's been basically a huge advance in our understanding of since kind of the early 90s. So the person you want to go to, the kind of the GOAT on the minimum wage, so to speak, is Aaron Dubé. He's at UMass Amherst. But basically, because we have an easy way to answer this question, right? So this goes back to, there's a famous paper in 1994 by David Card and Alan Kruger, and they wanted to answer what's the effect of the minimum wage. And the problem is that if I'm just looking at data that just has minimum wage by state, that's not randomly assigned, right? That I don't have like a clean treatment and control group. So what they did in that early paper was look at New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And one of the states, I think it was New Jersey, but I could be remembering wrong, raised the minimum wage, the other did not. And what they do is they take all the counties right on the border, right? So at the border of the states, there's a policy discontinuity. But basically, think about Vancouver and Portland.
Right, exactly. They're pretty much the same place.
Right. They're the same geography, basically the same labor market. So one can act as a control group.
Oh, interesting.
This is kind of the method of empirical work that's popular in economics, this type of quasi-experimental study, or what's called a natural experiment sometimes. And they looked at the effect of the minimum wage on employment, and they found it really didn't have much of an effect on employment, that it was either basically zero or really, maybe slightly negative, but not in a statistically significant sense.
So by employment, you mean number of people who have jobs?
Right.
Okay.
And so that was 1994. Since then, Aaron Dubé at UMass has done a number of papers on this. So one, he takes that formula from Card and Kruger and generalized it to every single border where there was a policy discontinuity between, I think he started in like 1980 88 in that paper and goes to like 2010 or something and looks at this, finds no negative effect on jobs. And then he has a bunch of follow-up papers. So one that came out a couple of years ago now, where he looks at the effect on not just employment, but the total number of jobs, and finds that it's either zero or slightly positive. And if you look at the effect on the distribution of family income, it's unambiguously positive in terms of the effect at the bottom. Now, that's not, it doesn't get us everything we want, because finding that existing changes in the minimum wage, which have generally been pretty small, right? If I'm raising it by a quarter, don't affect employment that much, doesn't tell me what's the optimal minimum wage, right? I don't know the answer to that question. So that's a harder question to answer in practice. What we do know is that small increases in the minimum wage are unlikely to cause unemployment, and that, as observed up to this point, they do improve kind of the distribution of family incomes for those at the bottom. So the effects aren't massive, but they're there. And again, the caveat being, I don't know what the optimal minimum wage is. It will certainly vary. It's going to be different in Portland than it is, in rural Tennessee. And basically all the studies that we have are for small increases, because that's mostly how the minimum wage has been increased. So I don't know what the effect of going from, $15 to $22 an hour. I can't say for sure that that's not going to, I don't know what the effect of that's going to be for sure. So, but I think, I think a minimum wage, like I do think it's an important policy. I don't know that it's the answer to it's not going to solve all the problems, right? So it's important policy. It's important to think about carefully and get right. But even if you have like the optimal minimum wage, which I don't know what that is, right? It's going to be, that's not going to, poverty, inequality, it's not going to solve all those issues. So
what about UBI, or universal basic income? We kind of had a little bit of a test case on that in the pandemic, right? When over the last couple of years, families have been getting pretty significant, depending on how many kids you have and what your overall income is, pretty significant cash from the government. I've got 4 kids, so it was great. I was like, yes, another Uncle Joe's giving me some more money. But one thing I noticed, and again, I don't know if these are connected, but then there's also been a sudden kind of labor shortage, and it's almost everyone out here, you see for help hiring, kind of desperate, especially for lower wage jobs. It's become harder to hire people in those jobs. I don't know if those are connected, right? Because you hear people speculating, right? Like I've heard that from my parents, like, oh yeah, well, if you just give people money, then they're not going to want to work, et cetera. So what's your thought? What do you know about those kind of strategies? Like, just giving a certain kind of base income from the government to people and families who have less income overall. Is that a good approach?
So we don't have a lot of evidence on what the causal effects of that type of policy are. There's a recent paper by Damon Jones, who I think's at Chicago, and a co-author, where they look at the effect of the Alaska Permanent Fund, since all Alaskan residents receive this yearly dividend.
Oh, how much is that? That's interesting.
Yeah, it's not a ton, but they try to estimate whether there's negative employment effects there, and the effects are they find that the effects are small, but it's hard to tell. I'm not sure how generalizable that is, right? Or what the external validity of looking at that is.
So people are paid to live in Alaska, basically?
Basically, yeah, some small amount because of it's the oil dividend, right?
Oh, right. Okay. That makes sense. So it's not just because it's hard here. Have a little money. Yeah. Okay.
But I don't know, so the labor shortage issue, I'm not sure I like that terminology. I have to think.
Okay.
I haven't thought. I think what is if you think about Econ 101, why is there a shortage? Well, a shortage happens when you have a price below the market clearing price. So the solution to a shortage is to increase the price. So in this case, it would just mean pay a higher wage. So what's going to happen is, if there's a shortage, Firms that can't pay the higher wage will go out of business. That's sad for them. But on the other hand, we're selecting for the firms that are more efficient because they can afford to pay the higher wage. So I'm not sure. I don't have super concrete thoughts on this. I was a fan. I think the child tax credit's a good idea independently of the labor supply effects because one, if you look at basically net of migration, like fertility is below replacement in the US and slowing population growth is a bad thing for economic growth in general. So kind of our models of economic growth, the kind of famous model the model that I used to think about growth is, it's called the Romer model, or at least it's a baseline. So Paul Romer won the Nobel in 2018. I'm forgetting which year, 2016, 2018. But basically, the idea is that growth is driven by the production of new ideas for things that can be used in the production process, and ideas depend on the number of people that you have, right? And so even if it's not just the total size of the population, there's some follow-up work. Chad Jones has a paper where he says that it's going to depend on the rate of population growth. So all that to say, the child tax credit is desirable for other reasons beyond the labor supply effects. If we're thinking about growth effects and kind of slowing population growth in the United States and fertility dropping below replacement, that's not a good thing, right? That's headed for kind of, if you think about what's happening in Japan, rising dependency ratios, way more the ratio of kind of people old age to young, and creates problems for the solvency of Social Security. There's lots of problems with slowing population growth. And so lots of reasons, economic reasons, to want a child tax credit, and that it makes it easier for people to have kids. And that's good for growth beyond any labor supply effects there. So I'm a fan of the child tax credit for those reasons. Also, because there's normative reasons too. I think it's just
absolutely.
If people want to have kids, we should make it easier for them to have kids.
Absolutely. Yes.
I don't have a problem with
Thank you for that. Having kids is hard, every little bit helps. So what then are some policies that you've studied that you think are effective in addressing income inequality?
Yeah. So the answer is, I don't have a good answer. I don't have like a silver bullet for solving it. So I wish I did. I wish I could say with confidence that, I do think kind of making the income tax more progressive. So I think we do need to raise marginal tax rates. Like they've been the top marginal tax rate's been steadily declining since 1950 or 1960.
Okay, wait. And that means rich people are paying fewer taxes. Like, is that what you're saying?
On the margin. So what
does that mean?
So there's different tax brackets, right? So So like suppose there was a system with two tax brackets, right? You would have one rate in the first bracket. So let's say between $0 and $50,000, you would pay on every dollar in that bracket, I don't know, a rate of 18%. And then between 50 and above, you'd pay a rate of 27% or something. Okay. I'm just making this up, but right. So that 27% would be the top marginal tax rate.
Okay.
Right. So I forget what the threshold is in the top tax bracket here in the US. It's in the hundreds of thousands of dollars to be in that bracket, but it's 37% right now. So I should know this off the top of my head, but I don't. So let's say it's going to bother me.
I'm impressed at your recall, by the way. So I feel a little bit better now that you actually have to look something up.
So for if you're a single person, only income over $523,000 is taxed at the top rate, right? So that's so that's 37%. So every dollar over 523,000, it's actually 600. So that 523,601st dollar taxed at a rate of 37%. Every dollar below that is taxed at a lower rate, depending on what bracket it falls into.
I see.
So in 1960, 1950, that top rate was 90%.
Wow. Wow.
Right. So I'm not saying we go back to those levels of top marginal tax rates, but using it a little bit is probably good. The other thing I think a principle of tax fairness is equal treatment for equal income. So that is a person who makes, say, $80,000, right? Whether that's $80,000 from labor income or from capital income, it should be taxed at the same rate. Right now, it's not. So capital income, is treated more favorably.
That's interesting because,
How it's
yeah.
taxed.
Okay, so you're saying that income that you get from, say, investments is actually taxed less than the income you get from working really hard at a job for 40 hours a week?
Yeah. So for most people, like the capital gains tax rate doesn't exceed 15%.
Okay.
Basically, it would be better if we could simplify the tax code and just say equal treatment for equal incomes. This is my opinion. You'll find economists who disagree, although I think most economists would like to simplify the tax code.
Sure.
But that may or may not positively affect inequality. But I think treating labor and capital income more equally would. But beyond somewhat increasing tax rates, there's debate about taxing wealth directly. So this is very kind of controversial, and this was in a number of in the Democratic primaries in 2020. This came up. Basically a tax on net worth over, $500 million, or pick your threshold, right? And so it's not income, but net worth, and you'd have to pay it. And so this is, Gabrielle Zuckman at Berkeley is a big proponent of this type of tax. I'm not sure where I stand. I think it could be a good idea in theory, but it's hard to enforce. There's other issues that go into wealth taxation. But that's another proposal that's out there. I don't think there's a lot of support for it. And then lastly, there's maybe perhaps more sort of industrial policy type interventions by, the federal government. So, one of my favorite historical policies, kind of one of the most successful things the federal government has ever done, is the Tennessee Valley Authority, which, was basically designed to modernize and develop the electricity infrastructure in the South. This was kind of a New Deal program.
Okay.
And basically the TVA is run a budget surplus for almost its entire life. So, it's basically on net brought in money. In addition to studies show that it increased kind of not just local productivity, but productivity in the aggregate. So it was a really effective policy. So it hasn't really been replicated. So something like that, which would, by direct, government investment that would also provide jobs, would be a way to kind of, it's not directly addressing inequality, but it's addressing maybe some of the underlying issues related to stagnation and kind of regional divergence, which I'm concerned about.
Yeah.
So that's probably not a satisfying answer. I don't have, the policies that are out there: increased income taxes, wealth taxes, increased government investment, are all things that people suggest. I do support, a child tax credit would significantly, it would have an impact on inequality. We know it reduced child tax credit that we had over the past, year plus did reduce child poverty actually significantly while it was in effect. And then its expiration, basically immediately after it expired, it, just mechanically plunged, a large number of children into poverty again. So, that was a policy that did have a big positive effect, but I don't have an answer. I don't really have a silver bullet for what's going to solve inequality.
Yeah. I kind of want to shift gears a little bit here and maybe step back, maybe listen to kind of the hard data landscape, but maybe more theological or philosophical in terms of, how should Christians think about money and economics, right? Do you think there are certain economic systems that are more harmonious with Christian values and a Christian worldview than others? And if so, what would those be?
Yeah, so I taught a class, and I think I'm going to teach it again, not next year, but the year after, thankfully. Anyway, in fall 2020, called Religion, Capitalism and Religion was the title of the course. Okay. And so a book that I have students read is this book right here, R.H. Taney's Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. I think you'd really like it. He looks very favorably on scholastic thinking. So But that this is a question that he wrestles with kind of in that book. And so I'll give you kind of two answers. The first is that Tawney basically proposes he says there's four different attitudes Christians can take, or a religious person can take toward kind of the material world and economic affairs, right? He says that, on the one hand, we could be kind of take the ascetic approach or aloofness, or almost like kind of, it's almost dualistic, and thinking that like, that's the material world. It's gross. We don't want to be a part of it. We should just be set apart as Christians. And so that's one attitude that we could take, that people often do take. The second is just indifference, right? That we could, think of it neither as good nor bad, but it's just largely, it's almost like it's a separate sphere that we have to take part in, but our engagement with the material world has nothing to do with our spiritual life, right? So the first attitude is it's a bad thing almost. The second is indifferent, right? That you have to earn a living, but it doesn't have anything to do with it. The third attitude, Tawney says, is we could take one of kind of a reformist approach, that we could get super agitated about specific economic reforms and specific economic activities and really dive in. He doesn't like any of those three. He says none of those are satisfactory. He says that basically he likes what he characterizes as kind of a scholastic view, which is basically one that views all of society as a single social organism that's holistically integrated. And he said, I'm just going to read, he has this great quote. He says that it may, the religious view of the world may instead at once accept and criticize, tolerate and amend, welcome the gross world of human appetites as the squalid scaffolding from amid which the life of the spirit must rise, and insist that this also is the material of the kingdom of God. And so he advocates for this more innovative approach. So that's easier said than done. I don't know any economic system. Economists are actually bad at thinking about this. If you look at like the past 10 years of journal articles in American Economic Review or Quarterly Journal of Economics, I doubt you'll find the word capitalism, or at most you'll find it a couple times. So we don't really, economists think about like market structure. So is there a lot of firms in the market, or is there very few? Is there a lot of buyers, or is there a very few? Are they making differentiated products or identical products? But thinking about social systems is not super common, and talk about capitalism even less so. I think most economists would be hard pressed to offer a definition of what capitalism looks like. I think Tawney's view there is that there has to be some consideration of where, kind of our material life, our economic life falls within kind of the greater moral order. So his reading of the scholastics is that basically economic life for them was just one of a multifaceted part of moral life, that it wasn't separate, but that economic decisions were like other sort of moral decisions that we had to engage in, and that there was, right rules or norms for governing them. And so, there was kind of the prohibition of usury, the law of just price, all this stuff, which the specifics of Tawney doesn't, not really care for. But his point is that it was thought of as kind of a sphere of life that we could analyze in the same way as we would other moral questions. The evolution of the development of capitalism throughout history has resulted in kind of the compartmentalization of the religious life and the material life, and that's created problems for the church and for how we organize our material life in general.
Yeah, you're right. I do like this guy. I like that fourth option. Of course, then my idealist is like, yes, that sounds right from those four options in terms of a Christian approach. But then there's my pragmatic side, which is like, okay, but what does that actually look like in practice? How do I, especially as an individual, right? I mean, I don't decide policies. I can vote, when the election cycle comes around, but what does that look like to live that way in relation to wealth in my own life, I guess?
Yeah, I think one answer is, at the very least, like, we have to actually consider the normative implications of our economic arrangements. So economists, we really like to fall back on efficiency. But our notion of efficiency is very narrow. It's So it's Pareto efficiency, named after the statistician Vilfredo Pareto. It's the idea a situation is efficient if no one person can be made better off without making someone worse off, right? Super narrow, right? And so it in a policy that is efficient or causes an improvement in efficiency is one that makes at least one person better off without making anyone worse off. But like,
Okay.
you know, a world in which you have one person that owns all the wealth, that's an efficient outcome, because I couldn't make myself better off without taking from the one guy who has all the wealth, and then he's made worse off.
Interesting. Yeah.
Right. And so that's a very narrow way of viewing economic arrangements. And so at the very least, economics itself can actually supply the kind of norms and morals that it can't supply the end we want to serve, right? It's very good about means ends calculation. And that's what economists are trying to do, but we're not very good at figuring out what those right ends are. And so, you know, Tawny points this out at the end of the book too. And this is the other quote of his that I really like. He says that both the existing economic order and too many projects advanced for reconstructing it break down through their neglect of the truism that since even quite common men have souls, no increase in material wealth will compensate them for arrangements which insult their self-respect and impair their freedom. And so, you know, some consideration of those ends, or teleology, if you want to call it, has to inform whatever our efficiency calculations are about how we're going to arrange our economic life. I don't think economists are the right people necessarily to do that. That's the work of theologians and philosophers.
Oh, that's a cop-out. Okay, so what about, okay, now I'm not talking to Professor Petach anymore, okay? So, but what about, like, how do you live? I mean, are there any kind of norms or principles that you try, given all of your kind of knowledge about economics, but also the fact that, you know, you do have a background in philosophy and, you know, you are a person of faith, presumably. I don't want to assume, but I kind of assume if you're teaching at Belmont. So yeah, I guess, how do you think about it just as a human being?
I mean, I don't know. It's hard. I mean, how do I think about it versus how do I, you know,
how do you live?
I don't do anything special in my day-to-day life. I don't feel like I make, you know, you can do it. You can to like create meaning in your own personal relationships. But in terms of like, it's very hard to solve these kind of systemic problems or feel like you have any impact on them at all, almost, right?
But what about just like how, like, choices you make with your own money? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think obviously, you know, and I think even research shows this, that, you know, people of faith tend to be pretty charitable in terms of donating and things like that. But what about even just in your local community? I mean, even your example there of a Tennessee program, like I wonder if there's something about the principle of, I don't know, like subsidiarity, that's what it's called in like Catholic social teaching, but this idea of trying to work in the sphere, in your own kind of local sphere as much as possible, rather than necessarily jumping to, what the government is doing nationally, but rather what can I do in my local community, whether that's like buying local, for example, right? Like that's one small thing, or I don't know, just little things like that. Are there certain choices you make about how you spend your money?
I'm very bad at that, and I'm a big hypocrite. But no, I think it's hard because I think all that stuff's great, and like who doesn't enjoy buying local when you can? But I think part of the problem is a lot of the major issues are are externalities at a level that can't be solved locally. So in a famous book by James Buchanan and Gordon Tullock called The Calculus of Consent, and Buchanan and Tullock are actually very, very, very conservative thinkers, but Buchanan makes this point that the size of the government or body that's needed to internalize an externality, so that an externality is an uncompensated cost or benefit that some activity imposes on a bystander, is proportional to the size of the externality. So with like climate change, right, that's a global externality.
I see. Okay.
So the responding body to internalize that externality has to be proportionate to the externality. So
right. Okay.
I'm just not, I think recycling's great. I think, driving an electric vehicle is a good idea. I don't think, any of those choices at the, individual level, the impact on climate change is the analogy I'm using here is going to be very small. So I think all of those things are good, and that's a good ethic to have. My concern is if you want to solve the problem, I don't know that that's going to do it. So maybe I'm just not optimistic enough, but I think, anyway, I'll stop there.
Well, thank you so much. I feel like I've been drinking from a fire hose, but in a very good way.
I think I've
learned. No, you didn't. No, I feel like I learned so much from this conversation from the very beginning, from, the technical difference between income and wealth. I'm like, oh, okay, cool. Now I know that. I've also learned that economists love to make up terms and phrases for everything that are not quite intuitive, but yet when you give examples, I'm like, oh, okay, that concept makes sense. So, thank you so much. And I also just feel kind of like this proud mama bear a little bit. Like, look how smart George Fox alums are. Like, I don't know. I think it's amazing the kind of work you're doing. And I'm so thrilled that you were able to give us like a little glimpse of your vast knowledge, Luke. So thank you.
I really enjoyed being on. Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
Proud George Fox alum. So
all right, go Bruins.
Go Bruins. We're the Bruins here at Belmont.
Are you serious? Oh my gosh, that's amazing. That's really cool. All right. Well, thank you so much, and it was just so fun to talk to you again. This has been a production of George Fox Digital. If you like what you're hearing, subscribe to the George Fox Talks podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts on your phone or computer. You can check us out on the web at georgefox.edu/talks, where we have videos, publications, and more. And you can also find our playlist on YouTube at youtube.com/GeorgeFoxTalks.